The first sign that her life was over was the sound of a man's boots on her floorboards. Ilara had been asleep, curled under the quilt her own mother had stitched, the one thing that still smelled of a life before Providence Gulch. The sound was wrong. It was not the shuffling step of her late husband, Jacob, nor the arthritic plod of his father. It was the confident, heavy tread of a stranger. Her eyes opened to the gray light of dawn slanting through the window, and she saw two men standing in her small cabin, their hats in their hands, but their presence an invasion. Beside her bed, Boulder, Jacob's old, brindle dog, growled low in his chest, a line of muscle quivering along his back. Then she saw them. Jacob's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Davies, stood in the doorway, their faces pinched and pale, devoid of sympathy. Mr. Davies held a piece of paper in his hand. He did not look at her, but at the wall above her head. "The house is sold, Ilara," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "These gentlemen are here to take possession." Confusion was a cold fog in her mind. "Sold? This is my home. Jacob built it." Mrs. Davies finally met her gaze, her eyes like chips of flint. "Jacob built it on our land, with our money. The deed was never in his name. It was always in ours. A precaution. A precaution against her, the woman from away, the woman who had taken their son and then had the misfortune of surviving him when the logging chain snapped. They gave her no time to dress in privacy. The two strangers looked away with a shared, clumsy embarrassment while she pulled on her worn wool dress and laced her boots. Everything she owned was in that one room: Jacob's spare shirt, a cast-iron skillet, 3 tin plates, the quilt. They told her she could take what she could carry. Not the bed, not the table, not the stove. Those were part of the sale. Mr. Davies pressed a small, clinking pouch into her hand. $20, the price of her eviction. He also gave her a folded, yellowed document. "This is yours as well," he said, the words a final, dismissive judgment. Jacob's inheritance. We're honoring his wishes. It was the deed to a worthless strip of land miles from town, a deep and treacherous ravine known to everyone as Davies' Folly. It was a joke, a piece of land so useless it was given as a booby prize in a poker game years ago. Giving it to her was the final insult. She walked out of the cabin she had called home for 3 years, the quilt over one arm, a small satchel with the skillet and plates in the other. Boulder padded silently at her heels, his body pressed against her leg, a warm and solid anchor in a world that had just dissolved. The entire town of Providence Gulch seemed to be watching. Faces peered from behind curtains. A few men standing outside the mercantile fell silent as she approached. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a man whose opinions were as solid and unmovable as the sacks of flour stacked behind him. "A sorry business, Mrs. Davies," he said, his tone thick with a pity that felt more like condemnation. "You'd be best to take that money and buy a ticket east. There's nothing for you here now." Ilara looked at his face, at the comfortable certainty etched into his features. She saw the same judgment there that she'd seen in her in-laws' eyes. They had already written her story's end, a defeated woman fleeing with her tail between her legs. A quiet, hard knot tightened in her chest. It was not grief, not anymore. It was something colder and stronger. She walked past him into the store. The $20 felt heavy and useless in her palm. She could buy a stagecoach ticket and disappear. Or she could buy a chance. She placed the coins on the counter. "I need a good felling axe," she said, her voice clear and steady. "A shovel, and 10 pounds of salt." Mr. Gable raised an eyebrow. He looked from her to the coins and back again. "That's a fool's purchase for a woman in your position. What are you going to do? Chop down your own ghost?" "This land is mine," she said, tapping the deed still clutched in her hand. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The decision had been made. She would not run. She would not break. She would walk to the edge of the world they had given her, and she would make it hold her. He weighed out the salt, sold her the tools. She left the store with less than $1 to her name, the weight of the axe head pulling at her shoulder. She did not look back. With Boulder at her side, she turned her face toward the west, toward the jagged hills that held Davy's Folly, and began to walk. The journey was a punishment. The sun beat down on the treeless plains that separated the town from the rough country, and the weight of her meager possessions grew with every step. The axe and shovel, her only hope, felt like instruments of torture, their wooden handles rubbing her palms raw. Boulder trotted ahead, then circled back, his panting tongue a flash of pink in the dusty landscape. He was her only compass, her only companion in a world that had shrunk to the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the dry earth. By the second day, the rolling hills gave way to broken country, a land of scrub pine and sharp rock. The map on the deed was a crude thing, little more than a sketch, but the landmark was unmistakable. A trio of skeletal, lightning-scarred pines on a high ridge. Below them, the earth simply fell away. Davy's Folly. She stood at the edge, her heart sinking with the terrain. It was worse than the stories. It was a deep, violent scar in the land. A ravine with sides too steep to farm and a floor choked with boulders and deadfall. The wind howled over the edge, a mournful, empty sound. This was not land. It was a grave. The town was right. Her in-laws were right. Mr. Gable was right. This was a place to die. Despair washed over her, a cold tide that left her weak-kneed and hollow. She slid to the ground, the tools clattering beside her. Tears she had refused to shed in town burned her eyes now. She had been so determined, so full of a cold, hard fire. But the reality of this place extinguished it like a bucket of water on a spark. Boulder nudged his wet nose into her hand and whined, a low, questioning sound that mirrored the desolation in her own soul. For a long, bleak moment, she sat there and believed her story was truly over. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the chasm, she noticed something. The wind, which had been a constant, whining presence at the rim, was absent down below. The air in the ravine was still, and something else. While the ground she sat on was rapidly losing its warmth to the evening chill, one wall of the ravine, a sheer face of pale limestone that caught the last rays of the sun, seemed to glow with a faint, stored heat. Driven by a flicker of curiosity, the last ember of her defiance, she found a rough game trail that zigzagged down the less severe northern slope. As she descended, the air grew calmer, quieter. The floor of the ravine was a jumble of rock and shadow, but against the western wall, under a massive overhang of limestone, the ground was clear. The overhang jutted out a good 20 feet, creating a natural shelter, a wide, shallow cave protected from the sky. She stepped under the rock shelf. The difference was immediate. The air was 5, maybe 10 degrees warmer than it had been at the rim. She placed her raw palm against the rock wall. It was still warm to the touch, radiating the day's sun like a massive, sleeping beast. It was a thermal mass, a natural heat sink. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, almost too faint to notice. Drip, drip, drip. In a dark crevice at the back of the alcove, water was seeping through the rock, a slow but steady trickle of clean, clear water, pooling on a small ledge before vanishing into the sandy floor. She stared at the dripping water, at the great stone roof above her, felt the stored warmth in the rock beneath her feet. This was not a grave. This was not a folly. The world had given her a worthless, broken place, but it had hidden a secret inside. It had 3 walls, a roof, a source of heat, and a spring of fresh water. It was not a home, but with work, with labor that would break a lesser spirit, it could be. The cold knot in her chest tightened once more, but this time it was not anger. It was resolve, forged in the heart of a place everyone else had thrown away. The work began at dawn the next day. It was a brutal education in the physics of labor. Her first task was to create a level floor. The ground under the overhang sloped gently, littered with small rocks and roots. With the shovel, she began to dig, her movements clumsy and inefficient. The muscles in her back, unaccustomed to such strain, screamed in protest. Blisters rose on her palms, broke and bled, leaving her hands raw and burning. Each shovelful of earth was a victory measured in ounces. Boulder watched from a patch of sun, his head cocked, as if questioning her sanity. After 2 days of relentless digging and scraping, she had a relatively flat, packed earth floor, about 20 feet wide and 15 feet deep. It was a miserable, aching triumph. Now she needed a 4th wall. The ravine was littered with fallen timber from storms long past, seasoned and dry. Using the axe was another lesson in pain. It was heavy, and her swings were awkward. The blade glanced off the wood more often than it bit in. But she persisted, learning the rhythm, the way to use her body's weight, the satisfying thud of a clean strike. She chopped the logs into manageable lengths, her breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat stinging her eyes. Dragging the logs into place was a feat of raw strength and leverage. She used smaller rocks as fulcrums and a stout branch as a lever, inching the heavy timbers across the ground. She laid the first course, then the second, notching them crudely with the axe. The wall rose with agonizing slowness, a crooked testament to her ignorance and determination. The gaps between the logs were huge, wide enough for wind and snow to pour through. For mortar, she turned to the earth itself. The soil near the seep was a thick, heavy clay. She mixed it with water in a hollowed-out rock, adding dried grasses and pine needles as a binder, just as she'd once seen men do for a sod house. She packed the thick, sticky daub into the gaps, her hands and arms caked in mud. It was messy, exhausting work, but as the wall became solid, a real barrier against the world, a fierce pride took root in her heart. She was not just building a shelter, she was building a life from the mud and rock of her own desolation. The most critical system was heat. Without a fire, she would not survive the first winter. A simple fire pit in the center of the space would fill it with smoke. But as she explored the back of the alcove, her hand running along the cool stone, she felt a faint draft. Looking up, she saw it. A narrow, dark fissure that snaked its way up through the limestone ceiling, disappearing into blackness. It was a natural chimney. With renewed energy, she began constructing a hearth. She found flat, heavy stones on the ravine floor and hauled them, one by one, to the back of the shelter. Her body screamed. Her muscles burned with a fire of their own. But the vision of a contained, smoke-free flame drove her onward. She built a raised hearth against the back wall, directly under the fissure, and then carefully stacked more stones to form a fireplace, leaving an opening at the front. It was crude, ugly, and almost certainly unstable. But when she lit the first fire, a small bundle of twigs and dry leaves, the smoke hesitated for a moment, swirled, and then, as if drawn by a gentle hand, rose straight up and vanished into the fissure. The stone around the hearth began to warm, and a wave of radiant heat pushed back the damp chill of the cave. Ilara sat before the small, flickering flame, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. It worked. She was still here. Water was life, and the seep was a miracle. But the small pool it formed was easily contaminated. She spent a day digging a deeper basin beneath the drip, about 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Then, using the same clay she'd used for her wall, she began lining the pit, packing the wet clay down with her fists and the back of the shovel until it was a smooth, watertight bowl. The seep slowly filled it. By evening, she had a small, clay-lined cistern of cold, clean water, protected from dirt and debris. Another system was in place. But survival required more than shelter, fire, and water. It required food, and her meager supply of salt and dried meat was dwindling. She needed livestock. She needed seeds. She had to go back to Providence Gulch. The thought filled her with a cold dread. Facing the town's pity and scorn was a harder prospect than wrestling logs and stone. But it was necessary. Leaving Boulder to guard her fledgling home, she made the long walk back, her hands calloused, her face browned by the sun, her clothes torn and stained with mud. She was a spectacle. As she walked down the main street, conversations stopped. People stared. She was no longer the tragic widow. She was something wilder, something they did not understand. Whispers followed her like flies. The Ravine widow, they called her. In the mercantile, Mr. Gable barely recognized her. He looked at her hard, calloused hands and the new, lean strength in her frame. He saw the defiance in her eyes. "Still here, are you?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "Come back for that ticket east?" "I need 2 laying hens," she said, ignoring the jibe. "And a nanny goat, if you have one. Also seeds, potatoes, carrots, anything that will grow in the dark." Her last few coins were on the counter. Gable laughed out loud. "A goat? Chickens? Girl, you're living in a hole in the ground. What do you plan to do with livestock? A wolf will have them before the week is out." But he sold them to her. He took her last dollar and tied the goat's lead to a post, crating the 2 squawking chickens. The entire town watched as she began the long, slow journey back. A stubborn goat pulling on a rope in one hand, a noisy crate in the other. They saw a fool, a woman clinging to a hopeless fantasy. They saw the folly girl, leading her folly menagerie to its doom. Back in the ravine, she cleared a smaller, secondary alcove in the rock face, not far from her main shelter. She walled it in with rocks and mud, creating a small, secure pen for the animals. At night, their body heat would be trapped, adding a small but welcome measure of warmth to the surrounding stone. They were not just a source of food, eggs, and eventually milk. They were living, breathing warmth. They were company. Her final system was the garden. The floor of her shelter was sandy and poor, but down on the ravine floor, trapped in pockets between the boulders, was a rich, dark loam, washed down from the plains above. For a week, she did nothing but haul this soil, bucket by bucket, up to her cave. She piled it in the darkest, most protected corner, creating 3 long, raised beds. There, in the constant cool and dim light, she planted the potato eyes and carrot seeds. She had seen miners grow pale vegetables by candlelight. With the ambient light from the cave mouth and the constant temperature, she hoped for a small, desperate harvest. It was a gamble, but every part of her life was a gamble now. She set snares along the game trails for rabbits and squirrels, salting what she caught, adding to her meager larder. The days grew shorter. The air grew colder. She was as ready as she could be. Mr. Gable came to see her in late autumn. He claimed he was checking trap lines, but Ilara knew he had made the journey for the sole purpose of confirming his own grim predictions. He stood at the edge of her cleared space, a look of smug satisfaction on his face as he surveyed her handiwork. He saw the crude wall of mud and logs, the goat bleating in its stone pen, the wisp of smoke curling invisibly from the hidden fissure high above. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head with a theatrical pity. "You've made a nest for yourself, like a ground squirrel, a proper little cave girl," he chuckled. "The folks in town are taking bets on how long you'll last once the first real snow flies. Most say you won't see Christmas." Ilara was turning a rabbit on a spit over her fire. She did not look at him. "I have enough wood," she said quietly. "Wood won't stop the cold in a place like this," he scoffed. "This whole ravine will be a tomb of ice. But I suppose a person has to learn the hard way." He tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, folly girl." The name hung in the air after he left, an insult meant to sting. But Ilara found it did not. He saw a folly. She saw a fortress. Let him have his name. The nickname stuck. When trappers passed through Providence Gulch, they brought stories of the folly girl in her ravine, living like an animal. The women in the sewing circle whispered about her, a cautionary tale of what happens when a woman refuses her proper place, refuses sensible charity. Her stubbornness was seen as a kind of madness. They imagined her freezing, starving, haunted by loneliness. But loneliness was a luxury she could not afford. Her days fell into a deep, rhythmic routine dictated by survival. Before dawn, she would rise to the cold, still air and build up the fire, its coals carefully banked all night. The fire was the heart of her world. While the stones of the hearth warmed, she would milk the goat and check on the chickens, their clucking a small, reassuring sound in the quiet. She would check her snares, her cistern, the chinking on her wall. Every day was a cycle of maintenance. Tend the fire, feed the animals, haul water, gather wood. The world outside her ravine shrank and grew hostile. The deep winter settled in, burying the landscape in a blanket of white. Her world became the warm, firelit space under the stone, a pocket of life carved from the frozen earth. The isolation was profound. Weeks would pass without the sight of another human being. But she was not helpless. She was the sovereign of this small, ordered kingdom. In the dim light, she watched with a quiet thrill as the first pale green shoots of her potatoes pushed up through the dark soil of her cave garden. It was a miracle of green in a world of white. She was utterly alone, but she was alive, and her systems were holding. There were smaller tests before the great one. A midwinter melt sent a torrent of water down the ravine, flooding the floor. But her shelter, set high under the overhang, remained dry. The water filled her cistern to the brim before receding. A pack of hungry coyotes, drawn by the scent of the goat, circled for 2 nights, their howls echoing off the stone walls. But her small, sturdy animal pen held, and Boulder's ferocious barking from the mouth of the cave kept them at bay. He was more than a companion. He was a guardian. One afternoon, a small section of her front wall, weakened by a freeze-thaw cycle, collapsed. A blast of frigid air rushed in, a reminder of her fragility. For 2 days, she worked in the biting cold to rebuild it, her fingers numb, her resolve tested. But she did it. She made the wall stronger, packing the clay deeper, reinforcing the logs with carefully placed stones. Each challenge was a lesson. Each victory, no matter how small, hardened her, proving the soundness of what she had built. The town might see a fool in a hole, but she was becoming a master of her own environment, learning the language of stone and wind and cold. The blizzard arrived without warning. It was not the gentle, blanketing snow of early winter. This was a blue norther, a wave of Arctic air that fell from the plains like a hammer. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single hour. The wind came first, a low moan that rose to a shrieking, demonic howl. It clawed at the ravine, tearing at the skeletal pines on the rim. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but in a solid, horizontal wall of white that erased the world. Inside her shelter, Elara felt the change. The wind screamed over the top of the ravine, but could not reach her. The stone walls, which had been absorbing her fire's heat for months, now radiated it back, a bulwark against the impossible cold. The air temperature inside her home dropped, but only to a chill, not the killing frost that was descending on the world outside. She built up the fire, the flames roaring up the natural chimney. Boulder lay near the hearth, his head on his paws, untroubled. The goat and chickens were huddled in their pen, sheltered and calm. The water in her cistern was cool, but did not freeze. Her systems, born of desperation and relentless labor, were holding against the worst nature could throw at them. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. In Providence Gulch, it was a different story. The town's confidence was a house of cards, and the blizzard was a gale-force wind. The conventional, well-built wooden homes, so praised for their neatness and order, became death traps. The wind found every crack, every seam. It drove the fine, sharp snow through window frames and under doors. The cold was a physical entity, a thief that stole the heat as quickly as it could be generated. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, but the heat rose to the ceilings and vanished, leaving the floors icy. Firewood stockpiles that were meant to last a month were devoured in 2 days. The sound of splitting wood echoed through the town as men broke apart furniture, fence posts, anything that would burn. Mr. Gable's mercantile, the heart of the town, had its great front window shatter inwards, blasted by a gust of wind, filling the store with a deep, suffocating drift of snow. The roof of the meeting hall, burdened by a foot of heavy, wind-packed snow, began to groan and sag. The town's infrastructure, its very sense of security, was collapsing. The people of Providence Gulch were discovering that 4 square walls and a good roof were no match for the raw power of a world determined to freeze them out. Their pride was freezing along with their hope. On the 3rd night of the storm, a sound broke through the howl of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her makeshift door. Boulder shot to his feet, a deep, warning growl rumbling in his chest. Elara grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, her heart pounding. No animal made a sound like that. It was human. She braced the door and pulled back the heavy log that served as a bar. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open. A figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled in and collapsed onto the earthen floor. It was Mr. Gable. His face was a mask of frozen desperation, his beard and eyebrows thick with ice. He was gasping, his lungs burning from the frigid air. He pushed himself up, his eyes wild with a terror that went beyond the storm. "My boy," he choked out, the words ragged. "It's Thomas. He has the lung fever. The house. It's so cold. The fire's almost out. We've burned everything." He looked at her, his gaze falling on the steady, roaring fire in her hearth, the calm animals, the impossible warmth of the space. The doctor said, "He said if we can't get him warm, he won't last the night. He'll die." Elara stood frozen for a moment, the piece of firewood still clutched in her hand. This was the man who had laughed at her, the man who had given her the name that defined her as a fool. He had stood in this very spot and mocked her, predicted her death. Now he was on his knees, begging for the life of his son, in the one place that was safe from the storm he thought would kill her. The bitterness was a sharp, metallic taste in her mouth. She could say no. She could close the door and let the storm deliver the justice he deserved. It would be so easy. She looked at his face, stripped of all its pride and certainty, and saw only a terrified father. She looked at her fire, at the surplus of dry, seasoned hardwood she had painstakingly stacked against the far wall. She had enough. She had more than enough. Her survival was assured. The question was what that survival was for. Was it just for herself, or was it for something more? The choice was never really a choice. Not for her. She had not built this life out of spite, but out of necessity. And necessity now stood at her door, begging. "Bring him here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And bring your wife." She did not wait for his stunned gratitude. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and grabbed the small sled she'd built for hauling firewood. She loaded it with as much oak and pine as it could carry, lashing it down with rope. She would lead him back, and then she would bring his family into her shelter. She would risk the storm not for the man who had scorned her, but for the sick child who deserved to live. She stepped out into the screaming white chaos, a small, determined figure fighting her way back toward the town that had cast her out. The journey back with the boy was a waking nightmare. Mr. Gable and his wife, bundled against the wind, carried their son, Thomas, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Elara walked ahead, Boulder at her side, breaking a path through the deepening drifts. The wind was a physical blow, threatening to knock them off their feet with every step. When they finally reached the relative calm of the ravine and stumbled through the door of her shelter, the shock on their faces was absolute. The warmth hit them first, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to come from the very rock itself. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a wood stove, but a gentle, radiant warmth that thawed their frozen faces and stiff fingers. Then their eyes adjusted to the firelight, and they saw. They saw the neat stacks of firewood, the cistern of clear water, the contented animals in their pen. They saw the impossible garden, with its pale green potato vines climbing up small trellises in the back of the cave. They smelled the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and wood smoke, and the aroma of a rabbit stew simmering in a pot by the fire. Mrs. Gable let out a small sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Mr. Gable simply stood there, his mouth agape, his gaze sweeping the room. He was trying to reconcile this scene, this warm, orderly, thriving sanctuary, with the folly he had mocked, the miserable hole where he had predicted Elara would freeze to death. The two images could not exist in his mind at the same time. One of them had to be a lie, and the frozen misery of his own fine house was too fresh a memory. They gently laid Thomas down on Elara's own bed of pine boughs and quilts, close to the hearth. The boy was pale and still, his breathing shallow and ragged. Elara ladled some warm broth from the stew into a mug and brought it to him, helping his mother spoon the life-giving liquid between his cracked lips. Mr. Gable finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it seemed to physically pain him. His pride, his certainty, the entire foundation of his worldview had been shattered. He looked at the woman he had dismissed as a fool, and he saw a wisdom he could not comprehend. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick and low. "I called you the folly girl. My God." He shook his head, unable to finish. "We were the fools. All of us." Elara looked at him, at the broken man standing in the middle of the home she had clawed from the earth. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction in his admission. His shame was his own burden to carry. She had firewood to stack and a life to live. "There is stew," she said simply, gesturing to the pot. "Eat. You need your strength." She offered him a bowl. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was a practical kindness, a grace offered without condition. And in that moment, it was more powerful than any sermon he had ever heard. For 3 more days, the blizzard raged. The Gable family lived in Ilara's shelter, a strange, quiet truce settling over them. Mr. Gable, humbled and silent, followed Ilara's lead, helping her chop wood from the sheltered logs she had dragged under the overhang, hauling water from the cistern. He watched her tend her animals and her garden, his respect growing with every small, efficient action. On the 5th day, the wind finally died, and the sun rose on a world transformed, buried and silent under a crushing weight of snow. That same morning, Thomas's fever broke. When the path was clear enough, Mr. Gable went back to the town. He returned hours later with a rescue party of 6 men, their faces grim. The story he told them had been one of disbelief, then of wonder, and finally of hope. The town was devastated. 4 people had frozen in their homes. Dozens more were sick. The livestock had been decimated. But Gable had told them of Ilara's hold, of the impossible warmth and life she had preserved. They came not to rescue her, but to learn from her. They stood in her shelter, their hats in their hands, their expressions a mixture of awe and shame. They saw what Gable had seen. They saw that while they had been fighting the winter, Ilara had simply stepped out of its way. She shared her resources without hesitation, giving them salted meat and the few potatoes she had harvested. She showed them the clay she had used for mortar, and even gave them a stack of the crude, sun-dried bricks she had begun making in preparation for building a proper smokehouse. In the weeks that followed, the town's relationship with Ilara transformed. The name Folly Girl was never spoken again. Some began to call her settlement the Hearth, for the fire that had saved the Gable boy. Others called it Ilara's Hold, a name that spoke of strength and endurance. The mockery was replaced by a deep, quiet respect. People would make the journey to her ravine not out of pity, but to trade for her well-made clay bricks, or to ask her advice on how to build a stone foundation that would hold the winter's warmth. Mr. Davies, her father-in-law, was seen less and less. His authority, built on land and money, seemed flimsy and weak compared to the unshakable foundation Ilara had built with her own 2 hands. Her story spread beyond Providence Gulch. Travelers carried the tale of the widow in the ravine who had survived the great blizzard of '83 when the town almost perished. Her methods, once seen as primitive and foolish, became a new kind of wisdom. When the people of the town began to rebuild, they did so differently. New homes were built with deep stone hearths designed to radiate heat. Root cellars were dug deeper, and walls were built thicker. They began to look at the land not as something to be conquered and built upon, but as something to work with, a source of shelter and strength. Her small, desperate act of survival had subtly changed the DNA of the entire community. Ilara herself changed little. She remained in her home, her life still governed by the simple, profound rhythms of the seasons. She expanded her shelter, building new walls of stone and her own fired brick, creating separate rooms for storage and her animals. Her garden flourished in the protected dark. She never sought recognition or thanks. She had what she needed. Years later, an old woman, her hands still strong and calloused, could be seen sitting at the mouth of her cave, the brindle dog at her feet, now gray around the muzzle. She watched the sun set over the western rim of the ravine, painting the limestone walls in hues of orange and rose. She had been given nothing but a worthless deed and the scorn of her neighbors. They had tried to throw her away, to cast her into a forgotten corner of the world. But in that broken place, she had found not an end, but a beginning. She had discovered that true wealth was not in a deed or a coin pouch, but in the quiet strength of stone, the persistence of water, and the unyielding resilience of a spirit that simply refused to be broken. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a legacy, written not in ink, but in earth and rock and the enduring power of a life well lived.